The war had turned the stars into ash. Humanity's fragile outposts were fading, one by one, consumed by an alien empire that cared little for anything other than their own expansion. But this was not how it ended. Not yet. Not as long as Gabriel Laskov was still breathing. "Brace for impact!" the lieutenant shouted, his voice barely cutting through the storm of gunfire and the screeching sirens echoing in the corridors of the station. "We're not leaving until every last one of them is dead." Laskov moved with calculated precision, a silent force amidst the chaos, his hands wrapped around the hilt of a weapon forged not in the fires of war, but of faith. His combat knife, an ornate relic that had been in his family for generations, glinted in the dim emergency lights, a reminder of the humanity he was sworn to protect. But here, in the depths of the station, there was no room for religion. Only survival. And Laskov was a master at that. The alien Khorath had breached the outer hull hours ago, their warships descending with the promise of annihilation. Now, the rebel forces, a ragtag collection of what remained of humanity's resistance, were cornered in the station's core. The Khorath had underestimated them. They thought their overwhelming numbers would be enough. They were wrong. "Laskov, get your head in the game!" Sergeant Rivera's voice snapped Laskov out of his thoughts, pulling him back into the firestorm. He glanced over to where Rivera crouched behind cover, unloading her pulse rifle into the oncoming horde. Sweat dripped from her brow, but there was no fear in her eyes. Just determination. Laskov didn't respond, but he didn't need to. The battle was all the response she needed. With a nod, he surged forward, his rifle raised. As the Khorath soldiers advanced, their black armor gleaming in the low light, Laskov's movements were fluid, instinctive. His weapon fired with deadly precision, each shot finding its mark. The first Khorath fell, a sickening thud as its massive body hit the ground. But there was no time to savor the kill. More were coming, too many to count. And the rebels had only minutes before their ammunition ran dry. "Prepare the bomb," Laskov ordered, his voice calm amidst the chaos. His mind was already calculating their next move, the next step toward their victory, or their doom. Rivera nodded, pulling a heavy device from her pack. The bomb was crude, but it was their best shot at buying time. If they could detonate it at the heart of the station, it would cripple the Khoratha's ability to coordinate, even if just for a few hours. It wasn't much, but it was enough to turn the tide. "Cover me!" Rivera shouted as she sprinted toward the center of the room, the hum of her rifle's energy cells still ringing in the air. Laskov's gaze followed her, scanning for threats. The station was dark, the emergency lights flickering in rhythmic pulses that made it feel like time itself was trapped in a stuttering loop. Then came the roar. The unmistakable sound of Khorath war cries, rising in unison as they pushed forward, their massive frames crashing through the wreckage. "Now!" Rivera's voice cut through the din. She slammed her hand down onto the bomb's activation panel. The lights above flickered one final time before the entire station seemed to hold its breath. The explosion was deafening. The force of it threw Laskov against the wall, his body slamming hard into the cold metal surface. He shook his head, clearing the ringing in his ears, and struggled to stand. The room had transformed into a hell's cape. Smoke billowed, and sparks danced in the air. The Khorath were disoriented, at least for now. They wouldn't be for long. Laskov stood tall, shaking off the disorientation. His breath was steady, his heart steady, but his mind raced. There was no time to waste. Not now. Not when they had this one shot. "Move!" he barked at the remaining rebels. His voice was sharp, commanding. The war priest was no longer a man of faith. He was a soldier. A weapon. And it was time to finish this fight. As they moved through the wreckage of the station's core, Laskov could hear the sound of Khorath soldiers regrouping. They were relentless. Like a plague, they had spread across the galaxy, and humanity had been nothing more than a nuisance in their quest for domination. But Laskov knew something the Khorath did not. They had underestimated the human spirit. He turned to Rivera, who was checking her rifle, the dust settling on her worn face. "Any word from the fleet?" he asked, his voice low. Rivera shook her head. They're still en route, but it'll be too late if we don't hold them off longer. Laskov's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the terminal nearby, the one displaying the station's schematics. A hidden passage. It was their only option. We're going underground, he said, pointing toward the lower levels of the station. It'll give us the advantage we need. Underground? Rivera questioned, but she didn't hesitate. You sure? Do it, Laskov ordered, and without another word they moved. The underground passage was narrow and dark, a stark contrast to the chaos above. The walls were lined with old human technology, outdated consoles and power cells from the early days of space exploration. It felt like stepping into a forgotten part of human history. But to Laskov, it was a symbol of the resilience humanity had always carried. No matter how far they were pushed, there was always something to fight for. They reached the heart of the underground complex just as the first wave of Khorath soldiers came through the entrance. Laskov's heart pounded in his chest, but his focus remained unbroken. His hand gripped the hilt of his weapon, the blade tucked securely at his side. He would fight, no matter the cost. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the comms. It was Harlow, the fleet commander. We're here. We've got your back. Laskov allowed himself a brief moment of relief, but it was fleeting. The Khorath were not done. And neither were they. Tell them to hit them hard, Laskov responded. We finish this now. For humanity. As the first wave of Khorath soldiers poured into the room, Laskov's voice rang out once more, the sound of his battle cry filling the hollow space. Asterisk for humanity, asterisk. The battle began anew, but this time, there was no backing down. The war priest had come, and the Khorath stronghold was about to fall silent. The sound of distant explosions echoed through the station, shaking the walls with a low rumble. Laskov's squad had taken the underground route to avoid the Khorath's relentless pursuit, but even now, he could hear the thumping of their war machines above. It was a constant reminder that time was running out. Laskov's hand instinctively brushed against the worn handle of his combat knife as he paced the narrow corridor. The flickering emergency lights cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the air tasted of stale metal and forgotten technology. They had reached the deepest level of the station, where ancient systems were still operational, buried under layers of dust and corrosion. Laskov felt a strange sense of irony. The heart of humanity's technological triumphs now lay dormant, overtaken by alien forces. But this wasn't a time for reflection. His mind was sharp, his focus absolute. They had one shot left, and it was hanging by a thread. Laskov! Rivera's voice broke through the silence, her tone tense. We're not going to make it if we don't get the drop on them first. Laskov turned to her, his brow furrowed. He had known this was coming. This was the turning point. The moment when it would all come down to strategy. We've got to hit them harder than they're expecting. Set the trap, he ordered. Rivera's eyes narrowed, but she didn't question him. She had seen enough of the Khorath to know that conventional tactics wouldn't work. As the last of the rebel forces assembled around Laskov, their faces grim but determined, he couldn't afford to let doubt take root. The Khorath might have overwhelmed humanity before, but now, with the right strike, they could be defeated. We have the advantage here, Laskov muttered, stepping closer to the terminal mounted on the wall. His fingers tapped the dusty interface, bringing the schematics of the station up. The room went quiet as the rest of the squad gathered around him, their attention fixed on the map of the complex. There's a weapons cache up ahead, Laskov continued, pointing to a blinking red light on the map. We need to get there and turn the tide. If we can get those weapons online, we'll have a fighting chance. I thought we were just holding the line, Rivera said, a hint of disbelief in her voice. We don't have the numbers to take them head on. We're barely holding ourselves together down here. Laskov didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, focused. That's the difference between victory and defeat, Rivera. We either strike first, or we wait to be buried. And I'm not waiting anymore. The squad exchanged glances, their unease palpable, but there was no time for hesitation. Laskov had seen what happened when people hesitated under pressure. It was either kill or be killed. The Khorath wouldn't show mercy. The rebels couldn't afford to do the same. "Move out," Laskov commanded. The team shifted into motion, their footsteps heavy on the metal floor. Laskov led the way, navigating through the darkened corridors with a precise, quiet grace that spoke of years of combat experience. Every turn was calculated, every decision weighed. The Khorath were known for their brutality, but they weren't invincible. Laskov had been fighting for too long to back down now. He could feel the weight of the war priest title on his shoulders, not just as a symbol of faith, but as a burden. "Quiet," he hissed, holding up a fist. Ahead, a set of doors stood between them and the weapons cache. They weren't alone anymore. The low, guttural growls of Khorath soldiers grew louder, their large, insected figures visible in the flickering shadows. They were scanning the hallways, closing in on their position. Laskov motioned for Rivera to take the rear. She acknowledged with a nod, readying her rifle. "We breach on my mark," Laskov whispered. "Make every shot count." The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional scrape of metal on metal as the Khorath moved. Laskov's pulse quickened, but his focus never wavered. The moment was close. He could feel the anticipation building, like the calm before the storm. "1, 2, 3!" Laskov shouted. In an instant, the doors exploded open, and the squad poured into the room, guns raised. Laskov took the lead, firing into the closest Khorath soldier with deadly precision. The alien staggered back, smoke rising from its chest as it crumbled to the floor. The squad followed suit, gunning down the Khorath in a brutal display of coordinated fire. Laskov's hands moved with practiced ease, reloading as he took down 2 more Khorath soldiers in quick succession. The rest of the rebels fought with desperation, but they were following his lead, every action purposeful, every shot calculated. "We've got the cache!" Rivera shouted, her voice sharp with urgency. "But we're not alone! More incoming!" Laskov's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the moment bearing down on him. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. The weapons cache was their last hope. If they didn't get these weapons online, they were done for. "Get those power cells online!" Laskov barked. "The Khorath will be here in minutes!" The team worked quickly, some manning the consoles while others kept watch. The sound of Khorath footsteps echoed louder, closer. They were coming for them, drawn to the weapons cache. But Laskov wasn't afraid. He couldn't afford to be. "Powering up," Rivera said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Almost there." A loud thud shook the room as the first wave of Khorath soldiers stormed in, their hulking forms blocking the doorway. Laskov raised his rifle, firing another round, but they just kept coming. "Hold them off!" Laskov shouted. "We're not done yet!" The rebels braced themselves, taking cover behind whatever they could. The Khorath were relentless, but the rebels fought with everything they had. Laskov's gun clicked empty, and he switched to his sidearm, firing into the fray as he covered Rivera. "Just a little longer!" Rivera shouted, sweat beading on her forehead. Laskov's eyes never left her as he fired again. The sound of weapons fire and screams filled the room, but all he could hear was Rivera's voice, steady and sure. She was the key to their survival. The weaponry was their salvation, and she was their lifeline. The countdown to activation began to beep, and then the lights flickered to life, and the air hummed with power. The weapons cache powered up, and the rebels cheered. "We're in business," Laskov said, his voice low. But there was no time for celebration. "Now we fight," Rivera replied, a grim smile on her face. The Khorath soldiers began to retreat, but Laskov wasn't about to let them go. Not now. They had one last chance to take back their future. He would see it through, no matter the cost. The war was far from over. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Laskov felt something stirring inside him: hope. The Khorath hadn't won yet. Not as long as he was still standing. The chaos of the battle felt endless, but Laskov's resolve never wavered. The rebel forces had managed to secure the weapons cache, and the Khorath had retreated for now, but everyone knew it was only temporary. The real fight was about to begin. Laskov's hands shook as he gripped the newly activated plasma rifle. It was a deadly piece of technology, a weapon capable of piercing Khorath armor with terrifying efficiency. But it wasn't the weapon that weighed on him, it was the responsibility. The decision to use this weapon had shifted the balance of the war. One wrong move, and the Khorath would respond with even greater force. They had taken too much already, and if they didn't act decisively, humanity would be wiped from the stars. "We're not done yet," Laskov muttered, scanning the dark corridor ahead. The team had regrouped near the central command center of the station, hoping to use its communications systems to contact the human fleet. The only issue was the Khorath were still hunting them, and they knew the resistance had just gained a significant advantage. "Laskov!" Rivera's voice broke through the tension, and he turned to face her. She stood by the terminal, her eyes wide with urgency. "I've got the fleet's coordinates. But we have a problem. They're not responding." Laskov's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, not responding?" "They're under attack." Rivera's voice was tight, filled with concern. "We're not the only ones who noticed that we've powered up some serious firepower." Laskov's heart sank. The fleet had been their last hope, their salvation, but now, it seemed as though the Khorath were striking from all directions. The aliens had underestimated them once. They couldn't afford to let that happen again. "Then we make sure they know we're coming," Laskov said, his voice low and filled with steely determination. "We'll go to them. No more waiting." He turned toward his squad, who were still setting up the newly acquired weapons. Their eyes flicked to him, catching the tension in his posture. They could sense it. This was it. No more retreat. No more second chances. They either won or they lost, and the stakes had never been higher. "We move out in 10, Laskov ordered, his voice brokering no argument. "Get ready." The squad readied themselves quickly, checking weapons and ensuring that their comms were active. As they moved toward the central lift, the station's eerie silence grew louder in the back of Laskov's mind. The Khorath were close. He could feel them like a shadow creeping along their every step. The air was thick with the weight of impending doom. The lift creaked as it descended to the lower levels of the station, where the remaining transports were docked. Laskov's heart hammered in his chest, each beat a reminder of the frailty of the human race. But the Khorath hadn't broken them yet, and they weren't going to. Not while he was still standing. They reached the dock with no interference, but as the doors slid open, Laskov's instincts screamed at him. Too easy. They'd made it without a fight. Something was wrong. He motioned for the squad to spread out, weapons raised. "I don't like this," Rivera whispered, her eyes darting from corner to corner. "It's too quiet." Laskov nodded, scanning the surroundings. The docking bay was vast, with several transport ships lined up, waiting for their cargo. But the usual hustle and bustle of the station's crew was missing. Only the low hum of the station's power systems and the distant crackle of a communication line filled the space. "Check the ships," Laskov ordered, his voice tense. "Make sure they're ready for launch." The team split up, checking each transport. Rivera approached one of the larger vessels, tapping a series of buttons to bring it online. The engines hummed to life, and a green light blinked on her console. "We're good to go," she said, though her tone was still wary. "Let's move," Laskov said, but before they could board, a loud thud echoed from above, followed by a sharp screeching sound that reverberated through the metal walls. The ceiling above them cracked, and a hail of debris came crashing down. "Ambush!" Rivera shouted, diving for cover behind a nearby crate. Khorath soldiers poured through the ceiling, their massive bodies dropping from above like predators stalking prey. They were armed, their weapons glowing with deadly intent. Laskov's heart pounded in his chest as he grabbed his rifle and fired without hesitation. A Khorath soldier staggered back, its armor dented, but it didn't fall. The alien's mandibles clicked in fury, and it charged. "Hold the line!" Laskov shouted, opening fire again. The Khorath were fast, and their numbers were overwhelming. His squad fired back, but the Khorath kept advancing, their resilience a terrifying sight. The battle was brutal, the sound of weapon fire deafening as Laskov and his squad fought for every inch of ground. The rebels had the advantage of surprise, but they were outnumbered. The Khorath were organized, relentless, and their superior strength made them nearly impossible to stop. Laskov's mind raced as he ducked behind cover, reloading his rifle. This was it. They were trapped, outgunned, and surrounded. The war priest knew they couldn't hold out much longer unless they acted fast. "Rivera!" Laskov shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. She peeked from behind a crate, firing shots at the advancing aliens. "We need that transport now!" Rivera gave a sharp nod, moving to activate the transport's weapons systems. The Khorath had already begun to flank them, pushing forward with a brutal efficiency. The rebels' ammunition was quickly dwindling, and Laskov knew that if they didn't break the Khorath's momentum soon, they would be overwhelmed. Suddenly, the transport's cannons roared to life, and a barrage of energy blasts ripped through the Khorath ranks. The aliens screeched as they were torn apart by the sheer force of the blasts. "We've got a hole!" Rivera shouted, her eyes wide with adrenaline. "Go!" Laskov yelled. "Get to the ship!" The squad sprinted for the transport, Laskov's mind racing. They had one chance to escape, and if they didn't take it now, they would never get another. The transport's engines hummed to life, and as the squad boarded, Laskov's gaze flicked to the chaos unfolding behind them. The Khorath were regrouping, but they were too late. The transport shot into the blackness of space, the station shrinking behind them. Laskov sank into his seat, his body exhausted, his heart still hammering. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. But for the first time in weeks, he felt something inside him stir. The rebels had struck a blow, but the war was far from over. "Take us to the fleet," Laskov ordered, his voice hoarse. As the ship streaked through the darkness, heading for the human fleet, Laskov's mind hardened. He knew one thing for certain: this war was about to get a lot more personal. And no matter the cost, humanity would survive. The stars outside the transport window stretched into long, jagged lines as they hurtled through space. The silence inside the cockpit was thick, a heavy blanket that smothered the noise of their thoughts. Laskov sat in the pilot's seat, his hands resting on the controls but not moving. His gaze was fixed on the vast emptiness ahead, where the fleet waited, faint pinpricks of light against the blackness. The mission had been a success, but it had cost them dearly. Many of the rebel squad had fallen back on the station, their sacrifices sealing their comrades' escape. The Khorath might have been pushed back for now, but Laskov knew it was only a temporary victory. The real battle was still to come. "Laskov!" Rivera's voice broke through the silence, and he turned to see her approach, her face grim. Her body armor was scuffed and torn, evidence of the brutal fight they just survived. "We've got a problem." Laskov's brow furrowed. He had expected as much. "What's wrong?" She stepped closer, her eyes not meeting his. "The fleet's not responding. I tried to contact them, but their comms are down. Something's off." A knot tightened in Laskov's chest. The fleet was their lifeline, their only hope of ending this war. If they were gone, humanity would be left to face the full wrath of the Khorath alone. "Get me a direct link," he ordered. "Now." Rivera nodded and quickly moved to the communications panel. The static crackled as she worked, but the flickering screen remained blank. She tried again, but the same result. "They're not even transmitting," Rivera said, frustration creeping into her voice. "Something's jamming their signals. The Khorath could be using it to hide their movements." Laskov's mind raced. The Khorath wouldn't just launch a straightforward attack, they were smart. Calculating. They'd be planning something, and the fleet was their next target. He could feel the weight of the situation settling like a storm cloud overhead. "Prepare to make a jump," he said, his voice low, controlled. "We'll head for the fleet's last known coordinates." "We don't have enough fuel for that," Rivera replied, a faint edge of disbelief in her voice. And we'll be flying blind. Laskov's eyes narrowed. Do we have a choice? Rivera hesitated, then turned to the console, setting the ship's course. As the engines whined to life, Laskov's mind didn't leave the fleet. If they were under attack, they'd need every weapon in their arsenal. Time was running out, and he couldn't afford to waste another minute. The jump took longer than he expected. Each second stretched into eternity as they closed in on the fleet's location. The silence between them only deepened, and Laskov could feel Rivera's concern settling like a weight in his chest. She was right to worry. This wasn't just a skirmish. It was their last stand. The ship shuddered as the coordinates locked into place, and the familiar sight of the fleet's ships appeared on the screen. But the sight that greeted them wasn't one of triumph. The fleet was in disarray, a handful of ships damaged or drifting in the void. Most were still in one piece, but their presence was eerily silent. Laskov's breath caught in his throat as the full scale of the situation became clear. What the hell happened? There's something wrong, Rivera murmured. They should have been more coordinated, more organized. This looks like they were attacked from the inside. Laskov's gut twisted. He knew what that meant. The Khorath were not only vicious, they were cunning. Prepare to dock, he ordered. We're going in. The transport landed with a heavy thud, the sound reverberating through the hull. Laskov's boots hit the cold metal floor, and the rest of the squad followed in close formation. The air inside the fleet's command ship was heavy with the smell of burnt circuitry and smoke. The walls, once shining with the polished steel of humanity's might, now showed the telltale signs of battle damage. Every step Laskov took echoed in the silent hall, the weight of the situation sinking deeper with every passing moment. We've been compromised, Rivera said, her voice barely above a whisper. Laskov didn't need to hear it to know it. The signs were all there. The Khorath weren't just invading, they were infiltrating. They moved deeper into the command center, weapons raised, every footstep deliberate. The flickering lights added to the tension, casting everything in sharp shadows. Laskov's mind was sharp. He could feel something closing in, like a trap being set around them. As they entered the command room, Laskov saw the devastation firsthand. Bodies, human bodies, littered the floor. The crew, the very people who had once fought with them, had been slaughtered. But it wasn't just the Khorath's usual brutality at play. No, there was something else. The bodies had been drained of their life essence, vaporized, almost like they'd been used for a greater purpose. Tell me you're seeing this, Rivera said, her voice shaking. Laskov nodded, his eyes narrowed. He walked to the main console and activated it, but the information he received was almost worse than the sight before him. The fleet had been sabotaged from within. They'd been infiltrated by someone on the inside, someone who had opened the door for the Khorath. Laskov's fingers tightened on the console, the realization sinking in like a cold, bitter poison. Damn it, Laskov muttered. It's not just an attack. It's a betrayal. The transmission began to play a pre-recorded message, one that Laskov recognized immediately. It was Shaw, Commander Shaw, the man who had once fought beside him in the early days of the war. But this wasn't the Shaw Laskov had known. This Shaw was different. He was smiling, almost smug, as he spoke. You thought you were fighting for humanity's survival. Shaw's voice echoed across the room, his words cold. But you were always just a tool. A means to an end. Humanity's time is over. We've made our deal with the Khorath. And you, Laskov, well, you were always too blinded by faith to see the truth. Laskov's blood ran cold. Betrayal. It had all been a lie. Shaw hadn't been leading a rebellion. He had been leading them to their doom. Everything we fought for, Rivera whispered, her face pale with shock. It was all for nothing. Laskov gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white. No, he growled. It wasn't for nothing. We fight until the end. We always fight. The final words from Shaw's transmission echoed in Laskov's ears. The war is over, Gabriel. Humanity is no longer yours to protect. Laskov's heart clenched as he turned to face Rivera and the squad. The weight of Shaw's betrayal hung over them like a heavy cloak. But there was no time for mourning. "We take the fight to him," Laskov said, his voice cold with fury. "We don't stop. We never stop. Not until we've taken everything back." And as the Khorath closed in on their last stronghold, Laskov knew one thing: they had no choice but to make their final stand. The war priest had come to end the war on humanity's terms, and he wouldn't let a single betrayal stop him from the ultimate victory. Even if it cost him everything.